In the steel-gray heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where factory smoke painted the sky permanent shades of twilight, and the Allegheny River carried the industrial dreams of a nation at war, there existed a hospital that would become the stage for one of medical history's most disturbing impossibilities. Allegheny General Hospital in 1917 was a fortress of modern medicine. Its 6 stories of red brick housing over 300 beds, and employing a staff of 47 nurses who worked tirelessly to care for the sick and injured. It was a place where science reigned supreme, where doctors trusted instruments and evidence, where every diagnosis followed logical progression from symptom to cause. But what happened in the winter of 1917 would challenge every assumption these men of science held about the boundary between life and death. This is the story of Helen Grace Murphy, a 28-year-old nurse whose dedication to her patients was so absolute that not even death itself could stop her from completing her rounds, and the horrifying medical evidence that proved she had been walking the hospital corridors, caring for the living, while her own body had been dead for weeks. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge everything we think we know about the limits of human existence. The Allegheny General Hospital occupied an entire city block in Pittsburgh's north side, its imposing Victorian architecture a testament to the city's industrial wealth and commitment to modern healthcare. Built in 1886 and expanded in 1902, the hospital had earned a reputation for excellence that attracted patients from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The building itself was a maze of long corridors painted institutional green, with tall windows that allowed natural light to flood the wards during daytime hours. The smell was distinctive, a mixture of carbolic acid, fresh linens, and the sweet sick odor of illness that no amount of ventilation could entirely eliminate. Helen Grace Murphy had joined the nursing staff in 1914, fresh from completing her training at the Pennsylvania School of Nursing in Philadelphia. At 25 years old, she had been young, energetic, with auburn hair she kept pinned in a tight bun beneath her white nurse's cap and green eyes that patients said held genuine compassion. She was the third of 5 children born to Irish immigrants who had settled in Pittsburgh's Strip District, where her father worked as a foreman at a steel mill and her mother took in laundry to supplement the family income. Helen had grown up in a 2-room apartment above a butcher shop, sharing a bed with her 2 sisters and learning early the value of hard work and self-sacrifice. Her decision to pursue nursing had been met with mixed reactions from her family. Her mother, Margaret, had hoped Helen would marry young and start a family, following the traditional path expected of Irish Catholic daughters. Her father, Patrick, had worried about the expense of training and whether his daughter was strong enough for the demanding physical labor that nursing required. But Helen had been determined, working nights at a textile factory to save money for tuition while attending nursing school during the day. She had graduated 3rd in her class of 24 students, earning particular praise for her clinical skills and her ability to remain calm during medical emergencies. By 1917, Helen had been working in the hospital's surgical ward for nearly 3 years. She had seen every variety of human suffering, from industrial accidents that left men maimed and broken to diseases that slowly consumed the body from within. She had held the hands of dying soldiers returned from the European front, young men barely out of their teens who would never see home again. She had assisted in hundreds of surgeries, her steady hands passing instruments to surgeons with the precision of a concert musician. Her colleagues described her as dedicated to the point of obsession, often volunteering for extra shifts when other nurses called in sick, rarely taking her allotted days off, and maintaining a professional demeanor even during the most stressful situations. Helen lived in the nurses' dormitory attached to the hospital, a 3-story building that housed 32 unmarried nurses in small private rooms. Her space was sparse but meticulously organized. containing a narrow bed, a small desk where she studied medical journals in her free time, a wardrobe for her uniforms, and a single photograph of her family taken at her youngest brother's confirmation. She ate her meals in the hospital cafeteria, attended Mass every Sunday at St. Mary's Church, 3 blocks away, and wrote letters to her family every Wednesday evening without fail. It was a life of routine and discipline, exactly the kind of structured existence that Helen had always found comforting. She had no romantic attachments, though several doctors had expressed interest over the years. She told friends that her patients needed her more than any husband would, and that she had dedicated her life to the service of healing. It was this dedication that would make what happened next so profoundly disturbing. Dr. Richard Pemberton, the hospital's chief of surgery, had known Helen for the entire 3 years of her employment. At 52 years old, Pemberton was a bear of a man with thick gray whiskers and hands that could perform the most delicate surgical procedures with astonishing precision. He had trained at Johns Hopkins and brought modern surgical techniques to Pittsburgh, earning him a reputation as one of the finest surgeons west of Philadelphia. He had always considered Helen one of his most reliable surgical nurses, praising her ability to anticipate his needs during operations and her steady presence in the operating theater. But in the early weeks of 1917, Pemberton began to notice subtle changes in Helen's behavior that troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The first sign came in mid-January, during a routine appendectomy on a 16-year-old boy. Helen had been assisting Pemberton as she had done countless times before, but during the procedure, he noticed that her hands felt unusually cold through the surgical gloves. Cold enough that he later told colleagues it was like being assisted by ice itself. He had mentioned it to Helen after the surgery, asking if she felt ill or if the operating theater was too cold. She had smiled and assured him that she felt fine, that perhaps the gloves were defective. But Pemberton noticed that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and there was a quality to her voice that seemed slightly off, though he couldn't identify exactly what bothered him about it. Over the following weeks, other staff members began reporting odd experiences with Helen. Nurse Catherine Walsh, who had been Helen's roommate in the dormitory for 2 years, mentioned to the head nurse that Helen's skin had taken on an unusual pallor, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in months despite working day shifts near the windows. Another nurse, Dorothy Klein, commented that Helen seemed to move differently, with a slight stiffness in her gait that hadn't been present before. Dr. James Fairmont, a young resident who worked closely with Helen in the surgical ward, told colleagues that he had tried to take Helen's pulse during a break, concerned about her pale appearance, but couldn't find it at her wrist. When he had asked Helen about this, she had calmly explained that she had unusually weak circulation, a condition she had lived with since childhood. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, and Fairmont had accepted it, though he later admitted that something about the encounter had left him deeply unsettled. Patients began reporting strange experiences as well. A textile worker recovering from surgery told his wife that Nurse Murphy's hands felt like ice when she checked his dressings, and that he could have sworn he smelled something like preservation chemicals on her uniform, though that made no sense in a surgical ward. An elderly woman being treated for pneumonia complained to her daughter that Nurse Murphy never seemed to blink, that her eyes had a fixed quality that was deeply disturbing. A 12-year-old boy with a broken leg told his mother that Nurse Murphy scared him, that sometimes when she stood by his bed he couldn't hear her breathing. These complaints were noted but dismissed as the confused observations of sick or frightened patients. After all, Helen continued to perform her duties flawlessly. She administered medications precisely on schedule, changed dressings with expert care, assisted in surgeries with her usual skill, and maintained detailed patient records that demonstrated clear thinking and medical competence. Whatever physical symptoms she might be experiencing apparently didn't affect her ability to do her job. Dr. Pinkerton, despite his growing unease, saw no justification for removing her from duty based on patient complaints that seemed more superstitious than medical. The hospital corridors were long and dimly lit at night, illuminated by gas lamps that created pools of yellow light, separated by stretches of deep shadow. Several night nurses reported seeing Helen walking these corridors during hours when she wasn't scheduled to work, moving with that characteristic stiff gait, her white uniform almost glowing in the darkness. When questioned about these late-night appearances, Helen explained that she often had trouble sleeping and found it calming to walk the hospital halls, checking on patients even during her off hours. This dedication seemed admirable rather than concerning, another example of Helen's extraordinary commitment to her patients. But as January gave way to February, the signs of wrongness multiplied beyond what could be easily dismissed. Dr. Pemberton noticed that Helen's handwriting in patient charts had begun to deteriorate, becoming increasingly shaky and difficult to read, as if she were writing with hands that no longer had full muscular control. Her skin had taken on a waxy quality that reminded him disturbingly of the bodies he had seen in the hospital morgue. Her movements, while still functional, had become noticeably slower and more deliberate, as if each action required conscious effort rather than flowing naturally. Other staff members began avoiding Helen when possible, though few could articulate exactly why she made them uncomfortable. There was something about the way she stood perfectly still when not actively engaged in a task, as if she were a wind-up mechanism that had run down and was waiting to be reanimated. There was the way her eyes seemed to focus on something just beyond the visible world, as if she were seeing things others couldn't perceive. There was the smell that seemed to follow her, faint but persistent, that several nurses privately described as similar to the odor of the morgue, though they dismissed their own observations as impossible. The breaking point came on February 17, 1917, during the morning shift change at 7 a.m. Helen had been working the night shift in the surgical ward, caring for 7 post-operative patients with her usual attention to detail. She had completed her final rounds, made her last entries in the patient charts, and was preparing to return to the nurses' dormitory when Dr. Pemberton arrived for his morning rounds. He greeted Helen in the corridor outside the surgical ward, noting once again how cold and pale she looked. Before he could comment, Helen smiled at him, that strange smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and calmly said, "I believe my time here is finished, Doctor. Thank you for your patience with my condition." Then, without any warning or visible distress, Helen Grace Murphy collapsed to the floor. Dr. Pemberton immediately dropped to his knees beside her, shouting for assistance. Within seconds, 3 other doctors and half a dozen nurses had rushed to the scene. They tried to find a pulse, attempted to detect breathing, held a mirror to her lips to look for any sign of respiration. There was nothing. Helen Grace Murphy was dead, and from the appearance of her body had been dead for some time. Her skin was cold to the touch, far colder than could be explained by poor circulation or shock. Her eyes were fixed and dilated, most disturbing when Dr. Pemberton checked for rigor mortis. He found her limbs already stiff, suggesting death had occurred many hours earlier rather than the minutes they had just witnessed. The body was immediately transported to the hospital morgue, where Dr. Edwin Chambers, the hospital's chief pathologist, performed a full autopsy that same morning. What Dr. Chambers discovered would be documented in one of the most controversial medical reports ever filed with the Pennsylvania Board of Health, a report that would be sealed for nearly 30 years due to its disturbing implications. According to the autopsy, Helen Grace Murphy's body showed clear evidence of having been dead for a minimum of 3 weeks, possibly longer. The internal organs had begun the process of decomposition, particularly the liver and intestines. The blood had settled and congealed in the lower portions of the body, creating lividity patterns consistent with death having occurred weeks earlier. The tissues showed cellular breakdown that could not have occurred in a living person. Most remarkably, examination of the lungs revealed no air exchange had taken place for an extended period. The tissues were collapsed and beginning to deteriorate in a way that proved respiration had ceased long before that morning's collapse. Dr. Chambers performed additional tests to confirm his findings, each one yielding results that defied medical possibility. He examined tissue samples under microscope, revealing cellular structures consistent with post-mortem decay. He tested the blood, finding it thick and partially coagulated in a way that proved the heart had stopped circulating it weeks earlier. He examined the eyes, finding cloudiness in the corneas that develops only after death. Every test, every examination, every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Helen Grace Murphy had been dead for weeks, yet dozens of hospital staff and patients had witnessed her walking, working, speaking, performing complex medical procedures during that entire time. Dr. Pemberton was called to the morgue to review the autopsy findings. He stood in that cold basement room, looking at Helen's body on the examination table, and listened as Dr. Chambers explained his findings in clinical detail. Pemberton's first reaction was to deny the evidence, insisting that some error must have been made, that the tests must be wrong. But Dr. Chambers was one of the most respected pathologists in Pennsylvania, and his findings were backed by comprehensive documentation that could not be dismissed. The evidence was irrefutable. Somehow, impossibly, Helen Grace Murphy had continued to function as a nurse for at least 3 weeks after her death. A meeting was convened in the hospital administrator's office that afternoon, bringing together Dr. Pemberton, Dr. Chambers, the head nurse Martha Reynolds, and hospital administrator Harold Blackwood. The atmosphere in the room was tense, each person struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with what the medical evidence clearly demonstrated. Martha Reynolds reported that Helen's work schedule showed she had worked 21 consecutive days without a day off, covering multiple shifts due to a shortage of nursing staff caused by an influenza outbreak. During those 3 weeks, Helen had cared for over 40 different patients, assisted in 17 surgical procedures, and administered hundreds of medications. Not a single error had been noted in her patient care. Not a single complaint about her performance had been filed. By all accounts, she had been a model nurse, performing her duties with competence and dedication. Dr. Pemberton described the physical changes he had noticed in Helen during those weeks. The cold skin, the stiff movements, the waxy pallor, the absence of a detectable pulse. He admitted that he had dismissed these signs, attributing them to illness or exhaustion rather than considering the impossible explanation that now seemed unavoidable. Other staff members were interviewed, each providing testimony that added to the growing body of evidence. Every person who had worked with Helen during those final 3 weeks confirmed that she had been present, active, and functional. She had walked the corridors, spoken with patients, performed medical procedures, maintained records. She had been, by every observable measure, alive and working. The question that haunted everyone who heard the autopsy results was devastatingly simple. If Helen Grace Murphy had been dead for 3 weeks, what exactly had been walking through the hospital corridors? What had been caring for patients? What had been assisting in surgeries? What had collapsed that morning on the surgical ward floor? Dr. Chambers spent the following weeks trying to find a rational explanation for what had occurred. He consulted medical literature from across America and Europe, searching for any documented case that might provide a framework for understanding Helen's condition. He corresponded with pathologists at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the University of Edinburgh, describing the case in careful clinical language while omitting details that might make his findings seem too incredible to be taken seriously. The responses he received were universally skeptical. Several pathologists suggested that his autopsy findings must be mistaken, that some combination of unusual physiology and environmental factors might create the appearance of post-mortem changes in a living person. Others proposed that Helen might have suffered from a rare form of catalepsy that mimicked death so closely that even trained medical professionals could be fooled. But Dr. Chambers had performed over 800 autopsies during his career. He knew the difference between a living body and a dead one, and every piece of evidence from Helen's autopsy confirmed that her body had been non-functional for weeks before that final collapse. Hospital administration faced a terrible dilemma. The medical evidence suggested an impossibility that could not be explained by any known science. If they made the autopsy results public, the hospital's reputation would be destroyed. Who would trust a medical facility where the dead apparently continued to work as nurses? But if they concealed the truth, they would be failing in their duty to document and understand medical phenomena. However disturbing, the decision was made to seal the autopsy report and classify it as confidential medical records. Official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, which was technically accurate even if it failed to address the true mystery of when that failure had actually occurred. Dr. Chambers was instructed to destroy his notes and cease any further investigation into the matter. The staff who had witnessed Helen's final collapse and knew about the autopsy results were sworn to silence, threatened with immediate termination if they discussed the case outside the hospital. But secrets in a hospital are difficult to maintain. And within weeks, rumors had begun to spread through Pittsburgh's medical community about the nurse at Allegheny General who had died weeks before anyone noticed. The nurse's dormitory where Helen had lived presented its own mysteries. When her room was cleaned out after her death, staff members found conditions that suggested Helen had not actually been living there for some time. The bed was made with military precision, but showed no signs of having been slept in recently. The small amount of food in her cupboard had spoiled weeks earlier, suggesting she hadn't eaten in her room during that time. Most disturbing, a journal was discovered in her desk drawer. Its final entries dated till late January, nearly 3 weeks before her collapse. The last entry read simply, "I feel so cold today. Something is wrong inside me. But the patients need care, and I will not fail them. Whatever is happening to me, I will continue until I can continue no more. That is my duty. That is my purpose." Hospital staff, who had worked closely with Helen during those final 3 weeks, began reporting disturbing dreams and experiences. Several nurses claimed to see Helen walking the corridors at night, still wearing her white uniform, still making her rounds, apparently unaware that her time had ended. Night security guards reported the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the rustle of starched fabric, the faint smell of carbolic acid and something else. Something they couldn't quite identify, but that reminded them of the morgue. Dr. Pemberton became obsessed with understanding what had happened. Despite official instructions to let the matter rest, he spent his evenings in the hospital library, reading medical texts about death and the moments surrounding it, searching for any scientific framework that might explain Helen's continued functionality. He corresponded secretly with colleagues who specialized in unusual medical phenomena, carefully describing the case without revealing identifying details. One particularly disturbing piece of information emerged from these investigations. A pathologist in Boston described a similar case from 1889, where a factory worker had apparently continued his duties for several days after a fatal industrial accident. His body kept mobile through some mechanism that medical science couldn't explain. That case had also been hushed up, the records sealed, the witnesses discouraged from speaking. The Boston pathologist suggested that there might be rare conditions where the boundary between life and death becomes blurred. where the body continues to function through some combination of habitual movement and force of will even after the biological processes that define life have ceased. He proposed that, in cases of extreme dedication or unfinished purpose, some essential animating force might persist temporarily in the body, maintaining basic functionality through means that transcended normal physiology. Dr. Pemberton found these explanations unsatisfying. They relied on concepts that had no place in modern medical science, ideas more suited to spiritualism or religious philosophy than to clinical medicine. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Helen Grace Murphy had been dead for weeks while continuing to perform her nursing duties with competence and skill. How was such a thing possible? The patients Helen had cared for during those final 3 weeks were interviewed as part of an informal internal investigation. Their accounts were remarkably consistent. Helen had seemed pale and cold to the touch, but her care had been excellent. She had administered medications correctly, changed dressings properly, monitored vital signs accurately, and provided comfort to those in pain. Several patients mentioned that she had seemed distant or distracted, as if her attention was divided between the immediate tasks and something else they couldn't perceive. One elderly man recovering from surgery told investigators that he had woken in the middle of the night to find Helen standing beside his bed, perfectly still, staring at him with those fixed green eyes. When he had spoken to her, she hadn't responded for several long seconds, as if she were a machine that needed to warm up before functioning. Then she had smiled that strange smile and asked how he was feeling, her voice sounding hollow and far away. The man had attributed this to his own medication-induced confusion, but now he wondered if he had been seeing something that others had missed, some sign that the woman caring for him was already beyond the realm of the living. The case of Helen Grace Murphy was discussed in whispered conversations throughout Pittsburgh's medical community. For years afterward, those few doctors and nurses who knew the full truth struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with their understanding of medicine and the natural world. Some chose to believe that the autopsy had been mistaken, that Dr. Chambers must have made some error in his examination despite his impeccable reputation. Others accepted that something impossible had occurred, that the boundaries between life and death were more permeable than medical science acknowledged. Dr. Chambers himself became increasingly withdrawn after the incident, spending less time on hospital administration and more time in the autopsy room, as if surrounding himself with the unambiguous fact of death might help him understand the ambiguous case that had defied all his expertise. He retired from Allegheny General in 1922, moving to a small town in upstate New York where he lived quietly until his death in 1934. In his personal effects, his daughter found a sealed envelope containing a complete set of notes from Helen Murphy's autopsy, along with a letter explaining that he had kept this documentation because he believed future medical science might be able to explain what 1917 medicine could not. Those notes were donated to the Medical History Museum at Johns Hopkins University, where they remain in the special collections, available to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in unusual medical phenomena. Dr. Pemberton continued to work at Allegheny General until his retirement in 1928. He never spoke publicly about Helen's case, but colleagues noted that he seemed to have lost some of his confidence in the certainty of medical knowledge. He began attending lectures on topics he had previously dismissed as pseudoscience, including discussions of consciousness, the nature of death, and the possibility that aspects of human existence might transcend purely physical explanations. In his later years, he wrote several articles for medical journals arguing that medicine needed to remain humble about the limits of its understanding, that there were aspects of life and death that current science could not adequately explain. The nurse's dormitory room where Helen had lived was reassigned to a new nurse within weeks of her death. But the young woman who moved in requested a transfer after only 3 nights, reporting that she felt inexplicably cold in the room, and that she heard the sound of someone walking past her door at night even when the corridor was empty. Over the following decades, several other nurses who occupied that room reported similar experiences, and by the 1940s, the room had acquired a reputation as being haunted. It was eventually converted to storage space in 1952, officially due to space reconfiguration, but unofficially because no one wanted to sleep there anymore. The surgical ward where Helen had worked her final shifts underwent extensive renovations in 1923, but staff members continued to report unusual occurrences. The smell of carbolic acid would occasionally appear in empty rooms with no apparent source. Patient call buttons would activate with no one pressing them. Surgical instruments would be found rearranged in precise patterns that matched Helen's preferred organizational system. Night nurses reported seeing a figure in an old-style white uniform walking the corridors, always disappearing when approached, always seeming to be making rounds, checking on patients that were no longer there. These reports became so common that they were simply accepted as part of the hospital's character, and new staff were quietly informed about Nurse Murphy as part of their unofficial orientation, usually presented as a harmless ghost story rather than a genuine mystery that had baffled medical experts. What truly happened to Helen Grace Murphy in January and February of 1917 remains one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in Pennsylvania history. The autopsy evidence, carefully documented by a respected pathologist, proves that her body had been dead for weeks while she continued to function as a nurse. The testimony of dozens of witnesses confirms that she was present, active, and performing complex medical tasks during that time. The only way to reconcile these facts is to accept that something impossible occurred, that the boundary between life and death proved more permeable than medical science acknowledges. Some believe that Helen's extreme dedication to her patients created a force of will so powerful that it kept her body functioning even after biological death, that her sense of duty transcended the normal limitations of physical existence. Others suggest that what walked the hospital corridors during those weeks was not truly Helen, but some echo or remnant of her consciousness, animating her body through means that lie outside the realm of conventional medicine. Still others propose that Helen might have existed in some transitional state between life and death, her body technically non-functional but maintained by processes that medical science in 1917 lacked the tools to detect or understand. Dr. Chambers' autopsy report remains sealed in the Johns Hopkins archives, available to qualified researchers, but rarely studied due to its controversial nature. The few medical historians who have examined the documentation agree that the evidence is compelling and well documented, but no satisfactory explanation has ever been proposed for how a dead body could continue to walk, speak, and perform complex medical procedures for 3 weeks. The case challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and the relationship between consciousness and physical existence. If Helen Grace Murphy could continue to function as a nurse for weeks after her body died, what does that suggest about the nature of life itself? Is there some animating force that can persist independently of biological processes? Can extreme purpose or dedication transcend the normal limitations of physical existence? These questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, reminders that despite all our medical advances, the boundary between life and death remains mysterious, and perhaps more permeable than we care to admit. What do you think happened to Helen Grace Murphy? Was it extreme dedication that kept her functioning, or something else entirely? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this case that challenged everything medical science thought it understood about death. If you enjoyed this story and want more mysteries that blur the line between the living and the dead, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates medical mysteries as disturbing and inexplicable as this one. Remember, the human body holds secrets that science may never fully understand, and the boundary between life and death might be far stranger than we imagine. See you in the next video.